You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. In this week's episode, I want to tell you about an amazing idea. It's the idea of voluntary servitude. And that is the idea that people are not free ultimately because they voluntarily submit to their servitude. It's a really fascinating idea, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the background and about the writer, Etienne de La Boetie, who wrote a book called Discourse on Voluntary Servitude during the Renaissance period. It's not a well-known book, but it's incredibly insightful. And this book has had a huge influence on many important philosophers. It also inspired the civil disobedience movement, but I think it's relevant in your own personal life as well. So that's what we're going to cover in this week's episode. Before we do, though, I want to say a big thank you to my new patrons on Patreon, Mark P., Robin R., and Luis N. If you would like to support The Voluntary Life, you can do so too by becoming a patron on Patreon. And if you do, you get access to bonus episodes and many other rewards. To find out more, go to my website, thevoluntarylife.com, or you can click on the link directly in your show notes, which you can access on your podcast player, or directly on my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. So in this episode, we're talking about this radical idea of voluntary servitude. And the idea is an answer to a question that many philosophers and thinkers have posed, which is, how come some people get to rule over the rest of us? How do they get away with it? How is it throughout history that you have a small number of rulers who maintain power over a huge number of people? Because if you think of any government or state, whether it's, an old school medieval king or a modern bureaucratic state, you always have a small number of people who essentially rule over a vast number of people under them. And the question is, why do the vast number of people who are not rulers put up with it? Why does anyone ever put up with being ruled? And the idea of voluntary servitude is a fascinating answer to this question. And that idea is that the only way that anyone can ever rule over others is by consent. No matter how harsh the ruler seems, the only way that they ever get away with it is when people consent to be ruled. That's how rulers always get away with it. Here's a quote from the philosopher David Hume, which expresses this idea quite well. He says, "Nothing appears more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophical eye than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is effected, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and military governments, as well as the most free and popular." So this is the idea that regardless of whether it's a totally tyrannical totalitarian regime or a relatively open Western liberal democracy, the only way that any government ever has power is because the people ultimately consent to it. Now, just to say, this is not the same argument to say that you individually have consented to your government regardless of what you think. This is not a social contract argument. The idea is not that every single individual tacitly consents to their government, but rather it's to say that the only way that any government actually has power is because the majority of people ultimately believe in it and support it in their ideas. Even if there might be a few individual rebels, the vast majority of people believe in the legitimacy of the government, even if it's a totalitarian one. That's the only way that a government can survive, is through consent. And of course, the really radical implication of that is that the moment the majority of people stop believing in a government, it falls. And that's very much the kind of thing that happened, for example, with the fall of the Soviet Union. It wasn't a violent revolution that overthrew communism in the Soviet Union. Communism ended when enough people stopped believing in it Now, this idea has all sorts of really interesting implications, but I'm just going to give you a bit of background first as to where this idea came from, because there's kind of an interesting backstory. It was originally put forward by a French aristocrat called Etienne de La Boetie, who lived during the early Renaissance period. He wrote the book in 1550 as a young man when he was maybe 20 years old, and he was very much a kind of Renaissance man. He was a distinguished poet and humanist, and he translated Xenophon and Plutarch into French. But he was also a member of the aristocracy. He later became a judge and a writer, and he wrote this book as a 20-year-old young man, but he never published it. And he later pursued a career in government in service to the king, and he never spoke about his ideas. And it was only after he was dead that this book became really famous. But it's an amazing book for a 20-year-old to have written, and it contains a really clear exposition of this idea of voluntary servitude, which other people like David Hume and other philosophers have written about too. But Etienne de La Boetie was the first person to really put this idea forward. And you've no doubt heard of Machiavelli, who was an early Renaissance writer who died just before Etienne de La Boetie was born. Machiavelli was writing during these early Renaissance times when it was a very, very religious time, and intellectual life was very dominated by religious ideas. Machiavelli was writing in this realistic, secular way about the state and about the state as power. And Machiavelli was essentially using kind of rational principles to advise rulers of how to dominate and rule. And Etienne de La Boetie is kind of a flip side of the ideas of Machiavelli, because Etienne de La Boetie was writing about how to overthrow rulers and secure liberty for the individual. So he wrote this book, which is incredibly well written and still very easy to read given how old it is, and it's very much an argument from first principles. And he was answering this question, why do people obey the government? So he puts forward this answer that people consent ultimately to their servitude. And he provided many explanations about how it is that the rulers go about getting the consent of the people that they rule. So the answer that Etienne de La Boetie gave is that people are trained to adore their rulers. That even though there are some people who will never believe in the idea of being ruled by others, the majority of people can be trained to love their servitude. And the way that they're trained is through a combination of the old technique of bread and circuses, providing handouts and entertainments to essentially distract the masses, and also by a class of hangers-on who legitimize the rulers. And these would be like the court intellectuals and priests in medieval times, or in our current day, they would be the intellectuals who legitimize the state and the government. But here's the really radical idea. If you understand that the only way that any government can rule is by consent, then if you withdraw that consent, ultimately the state can't rule. This is the way that Etienne de La Boetie put it, I think very beautifully, in his treatise. He said, "Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him, like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight and break into pieces." So the real implication of this idea of voluntary servitude is that we get exactly the rulers and policies that most people think are legitimate. And if you want to change the world, if you want to make the world a better place, you have to change people's ideas of what is legitimate. That's what really matters. Ideas are ultimately the driving force. Because even the most powerful states, even the most tyrannical states, depend on the vast majority of people believing in them and supporting them morally and intellectually. And if you withdraw your moral and intellectual consent and help others to understand why, then you really undermine the power of those in the state. So I mentioned in the beginning that I think this has relevance for your personal life as well as just being an interesting philosophical idea. And the relevance that I find for myself is that if I choose not to give any oxygen to politics at all, I don't give politicians my interest. I don't follow the drama and gossip of day-to-day politics. I don't have any respect whatsoever for the institutions of the state, be that the Prime Minister in the UK or the President in the US or any of these other institutions. And that's regardless of the specific individual who's in right now. If you hate the current Prime Minister or President, but you believe in the institution, then you ultimately give that current Prime Minister or President power. Because your belief in the institution itself, your belief in the legitimacy of that President or Prime Minister ruling over you is what gives that person power. And the moment you actually withdraw your interest and intellectual effort and consent and moral support for the state, you undermine every single politician, including the current one. So the way I approach politics is to say, I don't see this as a reasonable way to solve social problems. I think there are better ways to make the world a better place through civil society and through technology and voluntary interactions and trade and entrepreneurship and economic development. These are the things that make the world better. And politics is a disgusting, dirty game based on fundamentally irrational principles. And if everybody thought like that, we wouldn't have rulers. And maybe one day humans will be able to live like that without a state. But in the meantime, at least what I can do is not waste any of my time following political drama, and also not give my intellectual and moral support to a system that I find so irrational. And that frees me up to focus on doing productive things with my life and trying to do good in the ways that I can in my own life, in my personal relationships, in creating things that I think provide constructive, positive contributions to others, like, for example, these podcasts and my books. And I think that's a great way to live. So I hope you found that interesting. I'd love to hear what you think. That's all for this week's episode. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.